Okay, so let's have a look at E1. This is the first section of 3 that you're going to write about in a fair bit of detail for the evaluation. So E1 is one of the marking criteria, and it's all about the evaluation of the research processes used specific to the research question. And you might spend roughly 600 words on this section. Essentially what you need to do is to evaluate or to judge the effectiveness of the research processes. And so we're not talking about planning processes like your Lotus diagrams or your mind maps. We're talking about the activities that you engaged in, the activities that you did that produced evidence or data that helped you answer a question. So one process might be creating your survey. One might have been doing your interviews. One might have been looking at books. One might have been looking at videos, etc. Each of those are individual processes that you've used. So what we're going to do is to talk about just how useful these particular processes were. Now we can talk about them as though they were really useful, but we can also talk about them as if they were of little value to us. In the evaluation, it's quite alright for us to critique and be quite, not negative, but we can be quite firm about what we believe worked really well and what didn't quite work quite so well. So some keywords that you might want to use, things like if you're talking about positive research processes, they might have been vitally important. You might have found that something was highly valuable or advantageous. If it wasn't quite so useful, you might say that it was relatively useful. If you had some processes that weren't useful, you might say that they were of little value, or they were useless, or they were disappointing or confusing. I know that many of you have, particularly in trying to get interviews with people, you found that process was quite useless, was quite disappointing, and so you're able to talk about that. So I'm going to show you an example of a paragraph in a moment of what this might look like. But essentially what you want to do is to make reference to examples of what you did to validate your point. But we don't want to recount. If you say, I did this, and then I did this, and then I went and looked at this source, and then I did this, you're going to find that you're not going to be marked very well. Okay? We're looking just to talk about the strengths and the limitations of these processes, not how or which ones did you look at which time. So if we have a look at a paragraph here. Now this is color-coded to try and show the difference between what might get you a C grade, what might get you the B grade, and what might get you to the A grade. So we're talking about an interview. So the interview with A, an expert in the field of B, was of critical importance. And so here we've outlined what process it was, who it was with, how they were an expert, and just how important it was. Here we're going to see why, as it provided further avenues of research in relation to C, which I had not previously thought of. And C might just be an idea or a concept that you were thinking about having a look at, but you didn't quite get there. The information provided by A did assist in answering the sub-question C as it validated some secondary sourced information. So this interview is a primary source, backed up what had been seen in the books or in websites. Now if you say just that, that will get you to the C level, okay, because you are evaluating the research process. You've said whether it was useful or not. But to go a little bit further, you want to be able to critique even the most useful processes. So it was obvious that a degree of bias was evident due to their response to my question concerning D. Upon reflection of this process, questions D, E, and F in my interview could have been modified to minimize the influence of bias within the interviewee's response. So there might have been some questions that you wrote that you realized weren't the best kinds of questions to ask this particular person. Maybe if you did a survey, you didn't quite get the right people to respond to your survey. Maybe they didn't know enough about your particular topic, and so the responses that they gave weren't that useful. That's the kind of thing that you would talk about here. Therefore, I've learnt that it is vitally important to conduct background research on the interviewee so that I could have been more effective in developing my questions. Furthermore, this has provided me with a greater appreciation of what it takes to develop a well-constructed interview script. So at the A level, really going that next step further to say, okay, this is what I should have done, and if I had gone and done this, here's what the result would have been. And so you can use a formula for this, and this is the way that I would suggest that you have a crack at it. What process did you choose? That's the first thing that you need to make really clear. Was this a relevant process, or why was this a relevant process to your research project? How did this process help you achieve a successful answer to your research project questions? And then what limitations did this process have in relation to you finding an answer to your research project question? Now, if you can answer each of those questions there, providing examples from your research, you're going to be doing a pretty decent job. So that is E1. Make sure you use these terms here, looking at the research processes used specific to your question. At the next video we'll have a look at E2.